Daily Bible Reader count. Mr. Jerry, can you lead us in a word of prayer before we start? Mr. Jerry, can you lead us in a word of prayer? Thank you. All right. So we've been continuing to study some of the wisdom literature, and we're going to start in the book of Ecclesiastes. It picks up kind of halfway there in chapter 5. Solomon most people consider Solomon to be the author of this book. Solomon wrote 3 books in the Bible. I think we probably know these. Song of Solomon, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. But I wasn't really aware he wrote 2 Psalms. There's Psalms 72 and 127. The way people generally break this down as far as when Solomon wrote these books, and it helps us understand, I think, the books a little better if you use this way, but they say he wrote Song of Solomon in the early portion of his life, Proverbs towards the middle, and Ecclesiastes at the end of his life. And once we start to get deeper into this book, you'll see why they say that. Ecclesiastes, it's related to the Greek word ecclesia. You've probably heard Edward use that word a handful of times. You may have an idea what that word means in Greek. Ecclesia. Called out. That's correct. Called out. Church. Very good. For the English translation for Ecclesiastes, we get a better understanding of the word preacher or teacher. So some people use those. And when you think about this book, what exactly do you think about? When Josh was teaching, he asked the same question of maybe one word that you think of when you think of Proverbs. I think it was wisdom. But what about Ecclesiastes? Anybody have a word that jumps out as far as when you think of that book?
I think of duty.
Okay. Anybody have anything else? That's good. To me, it was really vanity. I don't know how many times that word shows up in the book. A handful of times. Meaningless. Because you see so many of those statements. That was just my word that jumped out. 2 types of material in this book, the way it's divided up, is you think of the older Solomon kind of issuing some words of wisdom, but you basically have personal reflections from an older wise man. And then the second portion of the book is Proverbs, just random Proverbs, basically similar to some of the things you saw in the book of Proverbs. That's kind of where our material is going to come from today as far as chapter 5, the first 12 verses. They hit several different points within just a few verses. But it helped me to understand it's just a wise old king sitting back at the end of his life and reflecting on it. And someone who had experienced all kinds of things of life that life has to offer. And as they sit at the twilight of their life, writing down some of the things that they had learned from this journey. And when you read through it, you look at it like that, I think it really makes a lot of good sense. If you got your Bibles, turn to chapter 1 in Ecclesiastes. I thought this was interesting, so I was doing some background study of the book. Abraham Lincoln quoted chapter 1, verse 4. And he did this in 1862, kind of right in the heart of the Civil War, as he's addressing Congress. the early portion of the Civil War, the Union and the North were kind of, it suffered some defeats, and things weren't looking that great for the Union. So in 1862, in his address to Congress, he quoted this, and I thought that was interesting. In chapter 1, verse 4, it says, "One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever." It's interesting that in the heart of the war, when all looked very grim, that use this verse to maybe inspire a little bit. Even in the darkest times, the earth is still going to go. All right. Another thing, I found a quote that an American author, I was not familiar with him, Thomas Wolfe, he had this quote about the book of Ecclesiastes. He says, "Of all I have ever seen or learned, that book," which he's referring to Ecclesiastes, "seems to me the noblest, the wisest, and the most powerful expression of man's life upon earth." So a powerful quote about really what all the wisdom that is in this book. I kind of, taken from some of the quarterly, you can have a good theme for the book. It might be that not only to learn from the preacher and all his wisdom, but to observe his journey towards understanding and acceptance of life's frustrations and uncertainties. And the journey itself is important. So we see Solomon at the end of his life, and he's got all these experiences, he's got all this wisdom, he's reflecting back, and he's just got so much good stuff to tell us. And it's a lot of the points he makes is, I've done all these things, I've accumulated all this wealth and greatness. It did not mean anything. What meant stuff was the life that I lived in between those times. And that's very true to us. Sometimes we get caught forward thinking about the future, thinking about how great it'll be when retirement, how great it'll be when we get to this, and this point, that we lose focus on the important things, and that's the time that God has given us to live our lives and the moments that we have in it. Because we only get so many moments to have an impact on this world, and the impact, what Solomon found out was, it wasn't all this money that I accumulated. And I'm afraid we spend more of our time accumulating the money and the things than worrying about the things that really matter. So, for the last several months, since teaching the middle school class, some of you have some middle schoolers in the class downstairs, we've been taking up money to support one of the orphans in India. It's about $25 a month is what it is. And as a result, we get some updates on how the mission work is going and some of the amazing things they do. But as most kids, they were really excited about this when we first started doing it. And then as we have moved through the months, their excitement to contribute to $25 has dwindled quite a bit. So I went and I gave them a little pep talk last Sunday morning, and one of the updates I thought was just so amazing. It was that out of the 600 orphans they kind of support in that area, they said 98% of those children who go through that orphanage become Christians and become successful when they leave that orphanage. So I tried to stress the importance of what we were doing by supporting this one orphan could be creating one Christian later on, and how much of the big impact that has on that particular life. They may not see it, but that's a major impact for that kiddo, and I want them to understand the importance of what they're doing. But that's an important thing, and that would be something as you look back and reflect on your life, that would be a good thing that you could think back to. Not some of the things you did for fun or the things you worked hard for and you bought all these things, that new car, but thinking back to those big, impactful moments that you can have on people's lives. As you see the preacher here, he's approaching death and he's looking back at his full life and wondering what it meant. What did all this life I live, all these things, what did it mean? And did it all matter? And I'm curious, is there anyone who, if you're kind of entering the twilight of your life, do you ever catch yourself looking back at those events in your life and looking back at big moments and things like that? Do you find yourself asking some of these same questions? What about this life? Or what about those things that I lived and I did, and did it ever have an impact? And that's kind of where Solomon's at. So I'm curious, do you have those thoughts? And sometimes it's good to think back on those things, and it gives you a little bit of perspective on what you did and what was really and truly important. Well, let's look at the first 7 verses. We're going to go through it. And the way the author breaks this up, it's kind of in 3 sections. It's always in 3 sections when I go through this quarterly, but these 3 sections are almost 3 different points, so it really was split up well. But let's go through verse 1 of chapter 5. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you on earth. Therefore let your words be few. So you see in those first 2 verses right there some important words of wisdom there of listen more than you speak. The author kind of used this compares it to worship. And if you look at the first verse right here, draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools. And then he's talking more about the sacrifice relating to those Old Testament offerings that God commanded them to do. But it was important for them to listen and to understand. And I think it was easy for some of them, and it's easy for us to get caught up into not really listening and hearing and understanding what God says, and more just doing what we want to do, and maybe even doing a showy thing. And Jesus, you're going to find, he repeats a lot of these same concepts too in the New Testament. Let's look in verse 3 here. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. That's as true today as it's ever been. We can really lose control of our tongues and be made a fool real quick by some of the things that come out. Verse 4, when you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. So be careful what we say to God and what we tell God we're going to do. He expects it to be done. It's easy to say all these things that we're going to do this, and do that, and then we just move on to 10 other things, and we forget what we've said, what we've told someone, or what we've told God. God expects us to be truthful and diligent in what we do. All right, verse 6 and 7 right here. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For if in the multitude of dreams and in many words there is also vanity, but fear God. And that's an important concept, I'm sure, over the next few lessons we're going to hit in Ecclesiastes, is to fear God. All right. That's the first section. And as we transition from the next 2 verses, in verses 8 and 9, the theme changes a bit. And let's look at them, and then we'll have some words. And if you've got comments, that's great. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a providence, do not marvel at that matter. For a high official watches over high official, and higher officials over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. So you see Solomon sitting up at the highest point of anyone in the nation of Israel, the kingdom that he's over. And he understands the corruption of a government better than anybody. And he sees that the corruption of the government, oftentimes, the ones who suffer from that are the poorest of people. So he points that out, and that everybody seems to be looking out for themselves. These higher officials, they're looking out and taking care of themselves and their friends, and then they've got officials under them that they're taking care of themselves and their friends. And that's just the way that kingdom works, and that's the way our kingdom works as well today. But Solomon is smart enough to look back and to see that out of all this corruption and everybody taking care of themselves, none of this would be accomplished without those people in the fields, those people in the lowest level who are doing those things to make other people's lives better. Solomon was wise enough to see that. And Jesus spoke quite a bit about that. In his time, that system was still in place as far as the poor were often the ones that were trampled on at the expense of the rulers of those nations. And you think about some of the people that he called out to be his disciples and apostles, and the people he went to preach, teach, and heal. Those were the people he was going after and to help. And I think we can all rejoice knowing that God is not a respecter of persons. It doesn't matter how much money we have. It doesn't matter our status in this world. God is going to be a true judge, and those things don't matter. Once we understand that, it gives us a better perspective on our lives. I go to a lot of auctions. I enjoy sitting in an auction on a pretty day and looking at other people's stuff. But I often catch myself thinking, this person worked hard for these things, and they really valued these things and these items, and that meant a lot to them. And then I quickly see that those items that meant so much and that person cherished so much is sold for $1. It's sold, sometimes not sold at all, and it's just taken straight to the garbage. That person valued them, thought they were special, but once they're gone, they're dead and gone, then most of the time they're just someone else's junk, and it just goes somewhere else. So we have to be careful in the amount of weight we put on our possessions and those things that we value, because they're not going with us. And in the end, as you look at Solomon, who had more wealth than anybody in his day, none of that mattered. And as he sits back and looks, it does not matter to him. It was meaningless. And
many of us today want to try to accumulate all these things so we got to build bigger houses and all that. And it's all right. It's for nothing.
You're right, Don. And I guess I went to Granville yesterday, and if you ever been to Granville, they've got that log cabin. How many of you have been inside that log cabin? And it's nothing unusual for that log cabin. If you've been in any of the old log cabins from 100, 200 years ago, it's one room. And I stood in there, and I looked to my right, and there's a bed. And I looked, and there's a trunk. And I looked to my left, and there's a kitchen table. And I looked a little further to my left, and there's a little stove or a fireplace. That's all in one room. I don't know how many people lived in that cabin. Probably more than one person, I would imagine. So as I thought, how much in my house, one bedroom, my closet, where would my clothes go? They had one trunk. And most likely, I don't know how many clothes they would fit in it, but it would be for the family probably. There wasn't a lot of room for stuff. They had a nice front porch. People most likely sat outside in the front porch, because the inside of that small cabin that probably housed 4 or 5 people, there wasn't a lot going on. I've been to many, many cabins across the country similar to that one. That's not that long ago. When we look back at where we're at, where we are now, to where we were then, that's 100 years probably. People were living in those homes. Some people in places in the world today still live in places like that. It's real easy for us to get caught up living in this society and world we live in. And it's easy to lose focus. Yes, I will say that.
Our children live in Murfreesboro as well as my sister, so we get down that way occasionally. These homes, the new homes they're building are huge, but the cars are parked out
I need some help with that. I really do. Got way too much stuff, and I'd say if you look around, we all do. It is. It's a job actually just cleaning a large house, and it's a job doing all these things. It involves a lot of time that could be better used probably serving God and doing better things.
Just look at the house where, when I grew up, most of them were small, four-room houses. They weren't on rooms, they were small, and they had kitchen, living room. A lot of times, a lot of kids would put the same bedroom, but it was.
That brings me to some of the points I was wanting to make. I was wanting to ask, some of you older individuals here, think back to that first home you bought. How much money did you spend on that home? Anybody want to remember that and admit to that number? $42,000 on yours, John. Anybody? $11,000. Nice home too. Wasn't a one-room log cabin. $11,000.
There was 5 of us kids, and we all slept in the same bed.
I was gonna say, when you said $40,000, I thought that was rich.
Yeah. That's what he really meant. Yeah. But think about to the first car you bought. How about that? Anybody remember the first car you bought? How much you paid for that? $300. $175. All right. Now, the point I want to make with all this, think back to the last car you bought. How much did you pay for that? Hey, they're kind of scared to admit that now. It's not uncommon for us to spend for a new vehicle to fit a family of 4 or 5, $40,000, $50,000. That's more than even Johnny's first house. He's just so young. So the point, we have, I guess, getting into the last few verses of Ecclesiastes, is has wages went up that much? No. If you've got Netflix, write down and watch this documentary. It's called Look and See. It's a documentary about an older gentleman who grew up on a small tobacco farm in Kentucky. And everybody around him farmed, and that hit home with me growing up. Probably the first 15 years of my life was spent in tobacco patches, small family farms of tobacco. It was very common that's what everyone did around the defeated area. So you didn't have massive farms. You had a farm of just a few acres. And you were able to help support your family by 3 to 4 or 5 acre fields of tobacco. That's been 30 years ago for me, basically. And that's been 50, 60 years ago. But just to look at the community of Defeated, from my childhood, everybody had crops. Everybody farmed, and that was what we did. We loaned out from farm to farm to farm, helping people, and we would trade labor. That's basically how that worked. Nobody had a ton of money, so we would work for them, and then they would come and help us work when it was our time. But there was a beauty and simplicity, and that's what this movie brings out into doing that. There were values that were taught. It was hard labor, but it was a community that supported that. And then it fast forward, and to kind of wrap that story up quicker, it fast forward to today's time of farming. There are very few small family farms. Nobody's growing tobacco now, period. But in order to raise that same family farm to help support your family, you've got to have multiple people. You've got to have 300-400 acres of land, and you've got to have $100,000 worth of equipment to support your family on a farm. The price of tobacco did not change from 30, 40, 50 years ago to today. The large amount of work and land you had to gather to make that same support for your family did change. So it showed the beauty that we had of that small family farm. And they talked to some of these modern day farmers and how stressed they were, because they were in debt through their eyeballs just to get enough money to go through and support, to do these things. And it was just work, and it was nothing but something they thought about all day long. Where in the past, you could have a job and then grow a few acres, and then that's all you needed. So some of you older people, you understand and appreciate that a little more, how much we've changed through that. But through that stress, the stress that comes with that farm, the stress that comes with all of our jobs today, because we live in a society where we have to have so much stuff that we think to get by that it can become overwhelming. How many of you answer emails at home? It's not uncommon to pick up the phone and have to deal with work emails at home, have to deal with phone calls about work, and many of you have jobs like that you're on call. You're working nonstop. You don't even realize it, and it's easy. So let's listen to what Solomon says in verse 10 right here and through 12. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners, except to see them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much. But the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. How true is that if you look at where we were in just a few short years ago to where we are now? So, I thought of maybe as you look at all those things, how expensive everything is now. That $11,000 home to now, if you look at just a standard new home, it's $200,000. Our wages have not increased that much. We have to work that much more, and I'm afraid we lose focus a lot of times on those values that God wants us to have and wants us to do. So we can spend all of our time keeping up with the Joneses, but we really don't leave time to keep up with Jesus and keep up with God. So Solomon saw that at the end of his life, and I think it's important that we look at those things today and pay attention to that as we don't lose focus on what truly matters in this world, and that's bringing people to Christ and going and serving Him. Well, thank y'all for your attention. You may have any closing comments? We will. And it's important, if we understand that, to look back at the life we have and what good we did in it. So that's a good question to always ask ourselves. What good, what have we done? How have we furthered the kingdom?